Thank you, Tani. Well, let's go ahead and jump in a little bit just to give you a little bit of a background on this particular topic. It was something that I had recently presented at NAGAP, which is, if some of you are unfamiliar, is the National Association of Graduate Admissions Professionals. And so I think this is in April, but the feedback was pretty strong. And I guess the overall tone, as you guys saw from hopefully the email blast, is that we're really trying to change the conversation around how people relate to what is officially termed as social media and begin to kind of elevate the conversation a little bit above that to begin talking about the bigger picture, which is really what the industry has started to coin as earned media. So before we get there, some of the statistics and research that we'll be presenting are kind of guided by many of the best practices that EMG has cultivated over the years with its pretty extensive education experience. As you guys saw earlier, we are continuing to kind of innovate and research alongside some of the biggest names on the Fortune 500 numbers and brands, but also really applying that to different number of other types of public institutions, and that includes things like private institutions as well as public and statewide. Okay, sorry about that. I was hearing a little bit of an echo on myself, so I wanted to make sure we fix that. So as we jump in, let's talk a little bit about exploring earned media and what it might mean for you. So how many of you are currently using the term earned media? And because this presentation was obviously done in a live event, I can't really see your hands, but this is a question you can ask yourself. The next one is, how many of you believe in social media? And in this particular case, we see pretty highly that not only are people not too familiar with what earned media is, but also aren't exactly sure of what how social media applies. The second is who is responsible for the social media channels in this room. And we looked around, and probably about 10% of the group saw that they were immediately applying their principles to performing some sort of capability when it came to social media. And then I think this was pretty funny, but I think that what we've seen in higher education is that most individuals start to really term the social media relating to the product itself. So, how many of you are ready to strangle somebody that is using the word that, the term, we must have Twitter, we must have Facebook? But the truth is that all social media is not actually earned media, but not all earned media is social media either. So what we really want to do is start to break down what would be considered earned media and how will that be applied to student recruitment. So before we dig a little deeper, we really want to look at the decision tree of how people are leveraging social media as well as earned media and making decisions around popular things such as planning a vacation. And you'll see in a second how we apply these principles to student recruitment. The first is that many individuals now have a number of touch points that they can respond to when making a vacation. And so in this particular case, what we see in the top left corner is, of course, the desktop, mobile, as well as any third-party influencers, blog sites. And then, of course, we have a number of real-world influencers. So in the old days, of course, it was the travel agent. But many times now, friends, family, colleagues are constantly engaging to determine where they might want to go for vacation. Also, when it comes to influencers, it's very important, especially when student recruitment, that we understand and identify any number of influencers from family, parents, as well as other influencers such as, in this particular case, Orbitz, Flickr, or any third-party researched information that are really helping this particular individual guide their decision. So as you can see, there are, of course, elements of here that are related to social media, but there are plenty of other areas that are actually related to influence. So taking that a step further, let's talk about how we pick a restaurant. The fact was that in 2011, there was a study by the National Restaurant Association that confirmed that consumers who were using social media, including apps such as Urban Spoon or Facebook, were not only dining out more, but were more likely to become return customers. So what it basically says is that, of course, we do understand that when individuals are making selections, and in this particular case, it's not even a lifelong selection, such as where they're going to attend to receive their degree, whether that be undergraduate or graduate, but really just something as quick as going to a restaurant. we start to find that when we utilize a lot of the tool sets that are out there to engage that particular individual, and a lot of these are not necessarily social media tools that they own, we start to see a tremendous amount of a higher level of engagement between the two. So this, of course, should be of no surprise. In the same token, it's how we pick a movie, as well as picking a medical provider. And in this particular case, I love to tell the story of my mom, who is constantly self-evaluating pretty much everybody in the family using the tool WebMD. So we can now look up our symptoms, and before even choosing a provider, are able to leverage social media and the crowd in order to better understand, sometimes good, sometimes bad, of what might be ailing us. In this particular case, we throw in another touch point, which is just that obviously sources like WebMD have gone online and mobile and have a number of apps that also make it very easy for us to access information and self-diagnose. And then finally, being able to select a doctor. So what we're starting to see is that this ecosystem, this life cycle of a patient and connecting to a doctor, has become very rather holistic and has definitely been influenced by a number of external influencers as well as the providers themselves. So the question is now, how are they selecting you? And I think that's really what the next important step is when looking at student recruitment, are what are the touch points, who are the influencers, and where are we really missing out? And so we're going to guide you through some of our kind of best practices in understanding how this bigger picture of earned media is playing into your overall life cycle of student recruitment. These are just some interesting facts that I wanted to point out. A lot of these are pretty popular, so I don't think that it will be anything that really surprises you, but it's really just important to keep things in context. Some of the ones that I thought were relevant I've bolded, such as number 4, 69% of parents are friends with their children on social media. So for those of you that might be joining us from the undergraduate side, you can really, of course, start to validate many of the things that you're seeing of those parents playing a very critical role, as well as the information that they're accessing from your website. Number 6 is 25% of search results from the world's top 20 brands are links to user-generated content. So a lot of times what we're looking at here is not necessarily the content or media that you're creating through your social channels, but a lot of the media and content that's being created for you, and that could be good or bad. So many times before we even start the conversation on whether or not we should be heavily using or utilizing earned in social media in student recruitment, it's really important first to create an understanding of or holistic view of what content is already being created for you. And especially if that's good, it's much easier to bridge that gap between should we be doing it and instead to begin the conversation of how should we be leveraging this content that's already being created for us. And really it begins with PR and brand equity and the positivity or in some cases negativity that that brand carries within your local community, as well as across alumni. So when it comes to student recruitment, what we're going to show is that the connectivity between those students that are now hopefully successful and engaging in the real world and are continuing to relate back their successes and or failures to your institution is really important to take into consideration when we're looking at student recruitment, because those are all the different pieces that could potentially be creating a stopgap of a particular student moving along the life cycle into your programs. The next is overall volume. So if we're really talking about where we might want to consider playing in, you know, LinkedIn obviously is continuing to grow, and there's been a lot of conversation here internally about how LinkedIn could potentially be leveraged by career services, connecting those to alumni, and then also really being and providing a value for student recruitment. So that's just one idea that we're starting to really test to see how other social channels, besides the most popular, of course, Facebook and Twitter, could potentially be used in not only student recruitment, but also student retention. So getting back to that conversation of when we were asking everybody to raise their virtual hands in the beginning, we really want to understand how you think of yourselves when it relates to these pieces. So would you consider yourself or your brand or your institution an influencer, a thought leader, a storyteller, a publisher, a connector, a problem solver? Or, in this particular case, are you a tweeter or thrower? So as I go through these, I think you pretty much get the idea that what we really need to do is start to think of ourselves as these kind of master architects and influencers and connectors, and not necessarily being caught up in the social channel or the tool itself. Because I think that's what we really get stuck in. And we're really thinking about different ideas of how we can start to leverage many of these tool sets. We start to get bogged down a lot in the overall channel itself. So what I'm hoping for is that we can start to change that conversation and focus our attention away from the channels. They'll be important. We'll get back to those. But to start to really understand earned media as a whole. So now where does earned media sit within the overall media ecosystem? So we wanted to take a more holistic review of the brand and your competitors, agnostic of the individual marketing vehicles, such as search engine marketing, social, mobile. So we've created a class of 4, and these are pretty popular amongst the general marketing marketplace. But owned media, which tends to be the largest and also the one that you have the most control over, are things like the names on your buildings or any truck that has your brand on it that's driving through campus. The website is a great example of owned media. So it's anything that you have 100% control over and can do anything you wish with. Paid media, of course, is things like billboards, broadcast television commercials, display advertising, search engine marketing, etc. So it also tends to be something that is becoming more and more popular in education in order to attract those students at the very early funnel, much like major brands have. However, it's not exactly great if you're going to be looking at how to convert many of those students. So it's important to build awareness, and it's important to guide those eyes to exactly where you'd like them to look, but we really lose control from there. Shared media, I think, is something that is going to continue to grow, and it's when 2 brands or 2 organizations or 2 businesses come together with not necessarily competing interests between them and leverage each other's crowds and fans and equity to build a stronger presence. And in this particular case, I like to use the example of many of the campaigns that have become popular, such as the Red campaign or the Pink campaign, where brands are realizing that if they can attach themselves to a nonprofit or cause, they're building a lot stronger equity and relationships with potential or even new audiences that they were not formerly able to attract without spending a significant amount of paid media. In the physical sense, we're also seeing stores like Target and Nordstrom's look for opportunities to come together in the same location because they've identified that their audiences are very similar, albeit I'm sure many of us would not agree that Target and Nordstrom's would be very similar competitors within the retail space. And then finally we have earned media, which is organic coverage of a brand across channels that aren't necessarily directly controlled or paid for. So you earn it. And of course, social media plays a critical part into this, but I wanted to really break this down even further so that you start to see that social media, again, is just that single component. So one of the first components of earned media is reputation management, or what the crowd is saying you are. So things like ranking, buzzworthiness, your clout, or sentiment around positive or negative conversations is all things that we would categorize under reputation management. And this unto itself is where we like to begin typically, because if your reputation is off, or we're not exactly happy with where we are with ranking, or the type of attention that we're gathering, or whether or not we think we're an influencer, it's kind of mute to begin the discussion around what social channels we'll want to begin with. The second would be the overall social media engagement. So what are you saying you are? And this really starts to come into play when looking at overall brand alignment, because sometimes if what the crowd is saying you are and what you saying you are aren't connecting, we're going to have some major challenges as we begin to move forward. And this is really the active engagement across those social channels. So if you're not putting out communications that align with what your brand message is, and you're not putting out communications that really relate to what students are looking for, then we're starting to have a disconnect. So if these first 2 panels are not in alignment, we're really having some challenges. Other things that would fall under social media engagement include things like promotions, direct outreach, as well as the content that you're creating. So I like to strip this out of the actual channels themselves, which you'll see in a second, because it really doesn't rely on the channels. This is something onto its own. The second is third-party coverage, or what influencers are saying you are. And this is very different, and I like to point this out, than what the crowd is saying you are. Because influencers are the ones that are many times providing direction for the crowd sentiment. So in many cases, we do know who these third-party evangelists or naysayers might be for your brand. But in other cases, we don't. And in this particular case, we're looking at resources like online publishers, the Wikipedia, I love when I put the still between everything, any particular blogs that might be popular, as well as the newsworthiness. So what are the syndicates picking up of the information that you're putting out there? And this really becomes important because you have two very different audiences that you may be serving. The larger consumer-based audience, or general student population, and those that might not necessarily be students, but are heavily influencing a student's decision because of the content they're creating. And then finally, we get to technology and channels. So where are you? In this particular case, it probably relates most to how people think about when they hear the word, what they think about when they hear the word social media. So things like your actual tools, control, things like analytics and intelligence around how different tool sets that you can use to gauge performance. Specific actions, as well as security of content or privacy of particular students that might be engaging within the overall earned media channel. So as you can see, the major takeaway here is that we have a lot to think about. And I guess, again, the major takeaway that I would like you to have is that before we really start to explore what we're providing across the social channels, or whether or not we should be using things like Facebook or Twitter or anything else, and how we might leverage that, it's important to take a step back and really understand the place that earned media that is playing within your overall social channel. So beginning with reputation management and then kind of building out from there might be a good smart move. So how is earned media helping organizations such as yours influence their big picture? In many cases, we're helping to determine how do we increase leads and online transactions in an increasingly competitive marketplace using earned media. And earned media really can relate to building awareness early on in the lead funnel. How are we identifying influencers and leveraging the crowd to increase brand equity and fans? And as we know, this isn't necessarily a way to guide and build a bunch of leads, but it really is important for moving them along the life cycle, that any touch point they have with overall sentiment, as well as any particular influencers, is a positive one. How do we test, streamline, measure, and optimize the conversion funnel for our target audiences? And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. How does our media plan reflect our primary personas and market? And in this particular case, we're looking back at that slide that really showed owned media, paid media, shared media, and earned media, and understanding, based on budgets, how we should be allocating funds to each of those particular categories. And a lot of times, analytics plays a critical role in that, as I'm sure many of you know. And when we've really done litmus tests of how well higher education is doing in relating specific spend back to those particular channels of media, it's been relatively poor. So in this particular case, if we were to begin, or if you were to begin down that process, providing some sort of direction or visibility into the window of how each particular channel is performing will be a critical first step. And then finally, how are we developing what we refer to as key performance indicators, or specific areas that we want to measure so that we can relate the performance right back to the success of student acquisition. So these are just some examples or case studies that I've kind of pulled out from our library that I wanted to show how earned media really helped us to craft a stronger strategy. In this particular case, we're looking at the client of American Sentinel University. And one of the things that we were tasked with was, how do we open up their particular marketplace and audience to a new area other than what they had traditionally been attracting, which was military students. And so much of the way that we wanted to guide the direction or the strategy was to hinge those efforts on what the social space and the earned media space was providing them. So some of the market insights were, many online universities had presences via own social channels, but participation and content contribution was very modest. So we saw some major holes and opportunities for an institution like American Sentinel to build out a pretty conceptual tactical roadmap of how they can leverage many of their competitors' weaknesses using earned media to create a stronger definition in the marketplace. And one of the cool facts that I've kind of posted throughout that you'll see was that in this particular case, 95% of wall posts are actually not answered by many brands, which is really sad because you have a ton of opportunity there. And we'll get to discussion, or if you guys would like to offline that, of how teams and your particular offices are now using resources a little bit differently, because it can be somewhat daunting when we look at the level of engagement that's needed to keep a lot of the social channels going and keeping them fresh and interesting and new. In many cases, I've advised at times to actually stop. If those can't be kept fresh and we can't respond, then we're actually doing a disservice and potentially creating an even stronger negative impression of the brand if we can't complete some of these general tasks around engaging thoroughly across your social channels. Earned media also helps organizations evolve their brand. EMG was selected by St. Cloud State University to overhaul their brand. And one of the things that I thought was so critical was to leverage the crowd, because many times, it would be really expensive if we were to have the level of focus groups and one-to-one conversations and interviews and surveys that would truly be needed to guide a stronger brand strategy than what we've typically seen from most institutions of the past. It's a very select group that's typically used, handpicked by the institution in order to really give us the most clear but sometimes very sliver-sized understanding of the overall brand and what it means for that community. So in this particular case, leveraging crowd, looking at keyword research, using surveys, and looking across a lot of the social channels and using social listening allowed EMG to get a much clearer understanding of really where there was opportunity within the brand and where there was a lot of discrepancies. And one of the cool things that I thought here, if you guys are ever looking for who might be doing it right, in this particular case, Johns Hopkins, Facebook Birthplace Harvard, and Notre Dame are some of the top schools for social media. So we've seen some really pretty cool engagement across a lot of their channels if you guys are looking at some of the contents being produced. Earned media also helps organizations identify new audiences and touch points. And we like to do storyboarding here at EMG. I think it's something that we've kind of borrowed from our storytelling roots and in entertainment. But it really allows us to create a stronger visual of taking potentially select target audiences and helping us to walk through different touch points that they might have in their day-to-day of how they might have exposure to your particular organization. So in this particular case, we're just showing how a non-traditional student, such as a working mother, is thinking about going back to school for culinary, and what are the different areas throughout their day-to-day life that they might have access to you. How are they being influenced by friends? How are they being influenced by family? And when we do this, we can start to really gauge where an attribute of earned media might play a critical role as we look back through that particular life cycle. And this is, again, just an example of early funnel where we want to be there, your organization wants to be there the second that they start to research. So that's just a good example of using visual cues. Earned media also helps organizations support a transmedia campaign. And transmedia is kind of the new term versus multimedia because, or integrated media, because not all times do we integrate or create multiple channels that work holistically together. In this particular case, it elevates that conversation to include story as a critical area that must be translated across the multiple media transforms. So just a little takeaway, you'll start to see a lot more around what transmedia is and it being used within the industry itself as the years go by. So what are some of the things? Well, things like improved organic search. We know that popularity of content, sharing of content, and how long people are spending on your pages, especially when it relates to maybe third-party pages that aren't necessarily owned by you. We see a tremendous improvement in organic search of individuals being introduced to your brand through popular keyword search terms around things like program information, etc. So making sure that that information is sound, is whole, is reviewed consistently is an important step. Things like social equity and the infamous fan or tweeter volume is very important when we look at the type of content that ultimately is being created. Things like third-party blog sites also are really important, especially if we have very singular programs that don't have a lot of competition. So really looking at who are the influencers in the space. Is there particular influencers that are providing that content for individuals? And how are we using them within the overall marketing mix? Things also like event promotions can help us to guide who might be our target audience. So there's a lot of exploratory things that we can do around surveying and promotions in order to understand who might be ones that we want to reach out to. So cool fact here, among college students and young professionals, 24% experience 3 to 5 interruptions in a given hour, while 84% get interrupted at least once while trying to complete a project. So it just shows that being everywhere at once becomes really important because we're not quite sure where they're going to be. The idea of the phantom student also is something that I'm sure many of you are struggling with. And the phantom student is really those that we really don't know about until application time comes in. And in some cases, we're seeing as many as 30 to 40% of an applicant pool are ones that we have never really self-identified or that have even made their way into our, in some cases, CRM or databases. So encouraging them via promotions, social sites, as well as any other promised tools or content is going to allow them to reveal themselves early. But it becomes very important that we're doing that in the most transparent way. Earned media is also helping organizations measure and optimize their lead conversion and transactional funnel. And so in this particular case, we're really just looking at a lot of the neat tool sets that are out there now that allow us to measure how things like conversation apply directly to lead pool. So the more content individuals are creating, the more content that people are sharing, the more positive sentiment that is out there is actually what we're starting to see being able to be measured to be directly attributable to overall lead generation and yield. Earned media is also helping organizations leverage the power of the influencers. These are just 2 great examples of some nonprofit clients of ours that are using those particular tactics in order to engage with pretty strong influencers that will go off on their own and use a lot of the content that is being curated. In this particular case, we have Alicia Keys' Keep a Child Alive and Best Friends Animal Society. So a lot of times the information that they're providing is very how-to and very kind of call to action. And those are that is the type of content that influencers are going out and sharing with their constituencies and community. So a lot of times we have to get beyond the promotional piece and start to think like a true nonprofit and understanding what kind of value we can create for our audiences and what kind of value sometimes we can create rather than just spending all of our energy on identifying content that is more kind of static in nature or very singular in nature. We can really become more conceptual in helping to teach others how to select a better program. I think a lot of times what I like about the nonprofit approach is that you're very transparent that you may not be the best fit for every individual, but you're going to provide them the tool sets they need to guide them to make that decision. So what that plays within your overall life cycle of earned media is kind of up to you. This was an interesting fact. Nearly every large charity is on Facebook, but only 60% of the Fortune 500 are. So they obviously have really started to understand what kind of role that plays. So here's something that we use almost on a day-to-day basis, especially when evaluating the overall life cycle for specific partners and clients. This is something I came up with. It's obviously has different iterations and a number of other types of marketplaces, but I thought it was pretty neat when we came up with it initially to help us to diagnose where there might be challenges within your overall life cycle. So what this does is it follows the life cycle of a student through initial opportunity. And when you see the words like initiator or follower, those are just kind of personality attributes that we've applied to an individual right at the beginning. And those are the ways that we're going to use content and call to actions to tap into the initiator or the follower type of individual. The other big takeaway here is that you can see that there are two broader categories down below. In the first four phases, we find that most students tend to be very vulnerable and emotional. So things like imagery, video, content, promises of what life might be post-graduation, all of those types of stories really work well here. But as an individual gets a little bit deeper, as I'm sure you guys can attest to, the type of media and communications and approaches that we would be taking with them changes dramatically, especially when we talk about the type of tone and content that we're creating for them. So the step here is really identifying where there might be major gaps in your student's lifestyle or life cycle in recruiting that particular student. So if we do a great job of kind of awakening them to the idea of selecting your particular program, but we're really breaking down because it's, popularity of specific programs might be guided by, news in the world, nursing shortages, or, specific programs in business, or fear that they might not have as rich a life if they didn't graduate. So those type of awakening are happening on their own in many cases. It's when that individual begins to search for how they might play a role in making a major decision to deliver on that particular idea is when a lot of organizations and institutions are falling short. So when you have an opportunity to introduce your brand as those that might help to foster the awakening of those ideas, this is typically where we're starting to see paid media play a major role, as well as a mix of paid and earned media of introducing the brand at that stage. In other cases, we find that the big gap is really between applying and the summer melt in a case of undergraduate admissions and final yield. And so how we might use earned media, obviously paid media does not really play a critical role here because we already have them in the funnel. But in some cases, it's helping them to self-identify who they are so that we can create a stronger relationship with them, provide more meaningful communications to them. Or in some cases, it's also really looking carefully at the influencers that are in play, the earned media channels that they might be accessing outside of your own media channel, such as your website or any print materials that we sent them, in order to help them make that decision. So it just goes to show you that earned media will be looked at and utilized very differently depending on where you might be having challenges. And the other major takeaway here is that earned media aims to reverse the flow of influence in the other direction, meaning individuals like alumni or current students could be playing a critical role in the backflow of influence rather than before, 15 years ago, where we really had a lot more control of those individuals that were either engaged or perhaps disgruntled. The other way to look at this is once we've diagnosed where there might be a challenge, and we want to take that a step further. So what you saw already is what I mentioned before, is that paid media, partnerships, and shared media, as well as social media and elements of earned media, all together form a pretty critical arm when looking at awareness, building initial awareness in those first 1 to 3 stages. As we move forward, you start to see that ongoing communication, as well as the leverage, changing the approach that we take with paid media, as well as partnerships, really begins to change. And then finally, when we're looking at enrollment, we start to drop off partnerships, as well as looking at retention, that paid media becomes to play less and less a role. But if you do see something that is a commonality of the entire life cycle funnel, it is earned in social media as well as community engagement that plays a uniform and universal role throughout the entire process. Another thing that we like to do, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if any of you are interested, please feel free to reach out to us, and I'll kind of guide you through this, is understanding the different strategic insights that we can gather in order to create our digital marketing strategy around earned media. So in this particular case, on the three areas across the panel, we have analysis, insights, and finally outcomes. And then we also have two larger groupings here that would be considered unstructured data as well as structured data. So unstructured data becomes much more difficult when trying to understand, gather, audit, and analyze that particular grouping of content, where structured data tends to be a little bit more easier. And what we're looking at is 4 different categories of analysis. So getting back to the beginning when we looked at what earned media consists of, we have what are the consumers saying about our brands. We have where are they saying it. We have what are other brands or content are they seeking. So this becomes really important in that early funnel of self-awareness and discovery. And who is mentioning our brand. So who might be not only the crowd as well as the influencers. So insights that we would consider under each of those categories are things like social reach, sentiment, affinity, and overall interest for when we're trying to understand what consumers are saying about our brands. And the outcome of this particular tactic is that it informs our message strategy. In the second category, content source discovery, where are they saying it? We're looking at really top creators, top followers, top sites, as well as different online communities. And this helps us to inform our media plan and social outreach efforts. The next category is what are the brands are they seeking? And looking at online behavior, category interest, and competitive share really helps us to inform messaging strategy as well as media planning together. So in some cases, if we don't have a lot of time, these are some of the inferences that we might be making by looking at this particular content individually. And then finally, who is mentioning our brand? So looking at things like demographics, geographics, psychographics helps us to better inform our target decision. So utilizing all of these gatherings together, again, helps us to create that more holistic digital marketing strategy around earned media. Something around brand alignment that we mentioned earlier was when things misalign is really where we have some challenges. So looking at overall reputation as well as the content that we're putting out there is really important to make sure that those things align. So in this particular case, an example might be that we say we are committed to wellness and health, but are they actually perceiving that you are committed to wellness and health? So things like your identity, insights, and communication all become really important that those are matching up as we go through a deeper dive into what they're saying about you. A major recommendation that I always tend to really lead with is that we really have to get beyond the demographic and audience profiling and start to really understand the rich tapestry that needs to be created to truly understand who your audience is today. And the really strong leverage that earned media provides is it can create that rich tapestry for you. This isn't necessarily just black and white, zeros and ones, analytics, or click-through rates. This is something that is much more richer, and that is things like influence and conversation and content, in many cases very dynamic content such as video that is being created by your audiences, by the community. And what we hope for is that we can leverage those life experiences, determine the type of content and its neutrality or its positivity or its negativity, and use that distinctly within our overall life cycle, whether it's overcoming it and overcoming objections or leveraging, again, that positive content and community to influence many new students to move along the file. Some other cool tactics that I like to think we'd use are things like creating, again, the storyboards and mood boards to capture a day in the life of a particular individual once an ideal earned media plan is in place. Also video documentary and really getting inside the lifestyles of students, not only to look at opportunities for sharing that type of content, but also just to research how they might be using specific touch points in their daily lives, what types of brands they might be having an affinity towards, where are they actually living, staying, eating, all become really important when we look at, again, those kind of touch points that we might be able to access or any particular shared media opportunities that we might note. A student lifecycle diagram and workflows also should be in place well before a communications and media plan are created. Monitoring, so where, when, why, and how are they engaging? Do we have analytics for those? If not, how do we get them in the most cost-effective manner? And when should we be looking at them? Identifying earned media consumption, analyzing key performance indicators, which we mentioned earlier, which is what are the more popular actions that we want individuals to take that we know mean value for our organization, or once we have their name, could be a key performance indicator, so that once we get a larger profile on that student, we can obviously tailor, again, communications to meet their needs. What types of content formats are they consuming? Is it video? Is it featurettes? Is it blog content? Is it are they tweets? Is it pictures or is it images? What types of topics are they drawn to? And this becomes really relevant in student recruitment when we're looking at the programs that we have and matching those up to the interest or need of the audience. And in some cases, they might match up, and in other cases, they don't. So earned media plays a critical role of helping to bridge that gap if the individual student isn't really understanding what you're promising or what you're providing. What keywords and nomenclature are they using in the search? Obviously plays directly into that. Mobile access and usage, whether or not apps, WAPs, or just optimized sites and content is the better approach. Understanding, especially in the non-traditional student space or graduate student space, is where work versus home accessibility and touch points differ between the two. And then also understanding access to broadband usage and touch points, especially if we're looking at international student audiences and marketplaces, becomes very important, as well as rural markets. And then finally, some profiling by online or social community behaviors such as crowdsourcing and social listening. And all of these I would encourage you guys to look up if you're not necessarily sure of what that might mean, because in many cases it's not as daunting as you think. The next would be identifying indirect relationships and influencers, and really tracking those back to how individuals might be finding you through an influencer, or how an influencer like a parent or a spouse might be playing in that overall conversion. And then finally, assessing conversations and sentiment. So as we begin to wrap up here, some things that I want as a major takeaway, and if there's any specific questions that you might want answered, please feel free to enter those now, and I'll take a look at those as I wrap up the things to think about. If not, feel free to also send those via email. So the first things to think about are exploring brand misalignment first. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it is really important that the match between whether or not what you're putting out there and what the audience is digesting is, in fact, the same. Benchmarking and experimenting is something that I think is also critical. This is a really important step, especially when we're thinking a larger strategy of implementing earned media tactics into the overall student recruitment life cycle, of starting with maybe a specific demographic or a specific geographic or a specific type of student, or even maybe a specific program. Diagnosing the funnel and pinpointing these areas of need, risk, and opportunity. We kind of went through that quickly with the life cycle, but also becomes an area that you really want to zone in on. So again, when it gets back to benchmarking and experimenting with those particular areas, we're not all over the place in trying to create a one-size-fits-all. Reputation intelligence and measurement, just really understanding whether or not those are in place and you have the ability to measure, or if we have a lack or a gap in that particular area, is something that we should begin discussing right from the beginning. Exploring search, search engine optimization, or organic search, as well as paid search, search engine marketing, and its impact also becomes important, of taking a look at how that will play a critical role or not into the earned media strategy. Identifying rogues internally is sometimes really fun to do, and many of you might already know who they might be. But those individuals that are already, somewhat going out in the Wild West themselves because of whether it's being driven by pain points, and that we sometimes have the inability to give them all of the tool sets and leverage that they need, Many times we tend to slap their hands, and instead, what I always say is that the rogues can sometimes be our best friends, because a lot of times they've already been out there in the wilderness trying many things out on their own. And so instead of slapping their hands initially, we need to give them subtle encouragement, some guidelines about what we would love to see, and really just sit them down and talk about what their needs are and why they are where they're at. Identifying potential partners internally, as well as encouraging those early adopters once we do have a plan in place, and rewarding them. Determining if a specific plan is feasible and measurable, I think are pretty justifiable and just equally important. And then finally, identifying the naysayers as well as the devil's advocates and making them stakeholders. So how do we transform those that are always on the flip side of under having some fear or trepidation in moving forward with an intermediate approach, and really understanding how they might play a role in actually creating stronger awareness around the program. So some of the questions that I see here is, does our earned and social media strategies need to be integrated, or can they be separate efforts that serve different purposes? And again, I think the big takeaway is that all social media strategies are in fact earned media strategies, but all earned media strategies are not in fact social media strategies. So they are uniquely integrated. Every social media strategy should be part of a larger earned media strategy, because if you're not understanding reputation management, if you really don't have a clear playbook for engagement, then they become somewhat misaligned and can cause a lot of challenges. Another one is, when dealing with negative sentiment on social media, how do you recommend responding to addressing those? And this is one of those things that it's different for any type of sentiment. Obviously, if it is around, you always hear of the topic of do not delete a post. There are times where we delete, but we really have to understand what the popularity or just how negative the sentiment is. In this particular case, we've also seen those that are engaging regularly. Many times the community comes to their aid and they don't need to do anything. Also, we'd like to see that many decision makers or executives love to respond to negative sentiment. And in many cases, because of the way that social media is built up, especially with specific tools, it's drowned out pretty quickly. And you can look at the measurement and analytics to see whether or not you should respond. In many cases, just having a simple playbook of common responses to negative sentiment and just letting them know that you're there, that you're listening, also helps to overcome many of those objections of repeat responders. The third question is, could an agency provide training in earned media? Would we also have to purchase strategy development or consulting? In many cases, we've provided just simple training to people like individuals like faculty members or your individual teams, and kind of an out-of-box solution to just really understand best practices, especially in those cases where you do not have a more complex strategy in place. So yes, absolutely, training, whether it's free, paid for, anywhere you can get it, can't go wrong. And then finally, what are some tactics you have seen used to increase international student recruitment? Well, that's a pretty good question. It really depends. In the case of social media, depending on the country and the world and the audience that we're trying to attract, we've seen very differing results. But in the case of earned media, there's one uniformity that we've all seen, which is reputation plays such a critical role. So in this particular case, when it comes to international student recruitment, looking at paid media is probably a first step, because in many cases they may not have heard from you, and we want to make sure that we capture them right from the beginning. The second portion is that we want to look at who and what they're looking for and relates to program information, statistics, or ranking. All of those, as well as location, are some of the more key topics that we see over and over again. Let me just see real quick. I see a question like, will copies of this presentation be available? It will be available in our Knowledge Center for download, as well as if you're interested in receiving a private copy. I think the next slide is my email. You're more than welcome to hit me up, and I will send you a PDF. Okay. If there's anything else, I think that is it. Tani, did you want to add a couple things here? Thanks again, everyone, and Tani's going to wrap us up and provide you guys just some final insights into where you can receive this information.
Thanks again to everyone for attending the presentation. As Damien said, the presentation will be available on various social media channels, and we will be sending a follow-up email to give you the links to those so everyone can have access. And feel free to follow us on our social media channels as well as Damien's. And thank you once again for joining us.